We're going to talk today about what we should be doing now, and we're going to do that by rewinding our clocks a little bit and going back to December and the fiscal cliff. Well, as many of you will recall, as much as you might not want to, the charitable deduction was front and center. Almost obsessively, the media, members of Congress, and the administration were clamoring around this issue. In a way, it was kind of an outsized focus on the issue, but it captured a lot of attention, and we were, whether we liked it or not, in the spotlight. Well, of course, this presented both challenges and opportunities, even for organizations like the Council on Foundations and the Alliance for Charitable Reform and others who've been working in this space for quite some time. Now, if we rewind our calendars even more to early 2009, when President Obama released his first budget, we land on the very first time we encountered the proposal to reduce the value of the charitable deduction. Now, at that time, it was one of those proposals you read and you think, this might be worth keeping an eye on, just in case. Well, fortunately, some of our colleagues in the charitable sector here in Washington, D.C. had that same nagging thought. And so the seed was planted to form the Charitable Giving Coalition. It started as an informal coalition representing a diverse group of organizations in the charitable sector who came together despite lots and lots of differences for one single purpose: to preserve the charitable deduction. That was nearly 4 years before the fiscal cliff. And it was nearly 4 years of navigating the issue and landing on a plan that could, with our fingers crossed, make a difference. It was the coalition's work over nearly 4 years that pushed back on repeated proposals, raised the alarms, sent hundreds of charitable organizations to the Hill, delivered thousands of emails, tweets, and other messages to Congress, and ultimately started turning the tide. Most importantly, it landed on a message that resonated on all political fronts. That is, the charitable deduction is different. It is not like any other deduction that provides an incentive for taxpayers to invest in something for him or herself. Rather, it's a deduction that encourages taxpayers to invest in their communities, in improving their society without personal gain. Now, this message was not the very first message that the coalition landed on back in 2009. It was actually a product of an evolution, of better understanding the issue, of better understanding our audience, and of making the bold choice to say, hey, wait a minute, we are different, and here's what sets us apart. Well, on the January 3rd, 2013 edition of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, the Charitable Giving Coalition was named one of five organizations in the nonprofit world who will make a difference in public policy in 2013. Well, I know that our panelists are chomping at the bit to illustrate to you the lessons learned from the fiscal cliff, and most importantly, how these lessons have strengthened our efforts, have fine-tuned our strategies, and have emboldened us. Because we experienced very firsthand that we can turn the tide and move from obscurity to a spotlight. So in the interest of time, and since we have until about 11:05 for this panel, I'm going to quickly preview the elements that each of our panelists is going to speak about, and then we'll move straight to the panel. First, Gloria Johnson-Cusack, who is the Executive Director of Leadership 18, will highlight the value of coalitions and how a diverse sector can come together to tackle a big challenge. She will give some insight on how the Charitable Giving Coalition came together, the give and take of working in a coalition, how participants can find a role that's appropriate for their organization and the resources that they have, and how the coalition will continue its work through tax reform and other fiscal challenges. Then Brian Flayhaven, who is the Director of Legislative Foundation and Recognition Programs at the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, will focus our attention on the specific perspectives of arts and education. Importantly, he will discuss why it's important that we not fracture the sector into winners and losers. Then Sandra Swirsky, who as many of you know is the Executive Director of the Alliance for Charitable Reform, will deconstruct for us the campaign to preserve the charitable deduction that reached its edge in the fiscal cliff and comment on how it worked and why. She will also translate what she heard from this morning's congressional panel and what messages she thinks that philanthropic organizations should be delivering on the Hill, not only over the next couple of days, but far beyond that. And then finally, Allison Hawkins, who is the Director of External Affairs for the Philanthropy Roundtable, will turn our attention to the Coalition's all-important, multi-pronged media strategy. She will highlight the value of working with the press as an echo chamber, the importance of telling your story through the media, and what elements of your story seem to really resonate now with the media, members of Congress, and a broader audience. So Gloria, I yield the floor to you.
I'm going to talk a bit about the stakeholders' mindset. You'll see the screen up there that's sort of going to get at that. I'm going to talk very quickly about the strategic positioning for the sector and then get to the part where I hope you will all be taking copious notes, because that's going to be a short laundry list of the lessons learned and what we hope you will use and then take back to your networks to make sure that we embolden this effort. I'll start by saying that in terms of the stakeholders' mindset, that essentially what this graphic is meant to show is that there are all kinds of ideological tensions, but there is shared understanding about the political realities. And that, in effect, allows us to be very focused and strategic in the execution of our work. There are divergent perspectives to the extent that, as you see over on the left side of that graphic, there are folks who are thinking that less government spending is a bad thing and that more taxes on some is good. Speaking in simplistic terms here. On the right side, not coincidentally on that graph, less government spending is good and higher taxes are bad. All kinds of ideological perspectives here, but there is a shared understanding about a few facts that guide our way, and we think they create wonderful opportunities. First, that communities need strengthening. No doubt about it. Everybody understands we've been in economic turmoil, that the turnaround will not happen anytime soon. That government spending is decreasing, whether you like it or not. Government spending is decreasing. And that creates a reality for, finally, the importance of the charitable sector being involved and being engaged. I think what you heard very clearly echoed in the comments that were made by our friends on the panel before from the Hill is that no one is going to be jumping up and down, whether on the left, right, Republican, or Democrat, to say we want to do things that are going to undermine the charitable sector. That's not the case. Even with all of the fiscal constraints that are out there, there is a political reality that lets smart people know that it's really not a good thing to be opposed to the charitable deduction. That being said, there are all kinds of threats that we need to be laying awake worrying about, because as was indicated in the comments made earlier, a lot of these decisions are going to happen behind closed doors. Those decisions are going to happen in the context of very major budget negotiations where big numbers, trillions and millions are being thrown around. And it is highly likely that in the unfolding of the legislative process, there will not be a lot of opportunity for even our friends to speak up and say, wait a minute, don't screw around with the charitable deduction. So even though we've heard all kinds of positive things said by our friends who were here on the panel, the reality is that there is an impending threat, and we have to act as though we understand that. On the next slide, I'll just say the main point here is that we have an opportunity to be very strategic in our positioning. The fact is that our policymakers are well-meaning. We have to make sure that we prevent them from creating unintended consequences. Well, we know you're doing good things in communities. Well, we know that communities need us more than ever. Well, we know that we're squeezing you on all sides because people are giving less. But we've got to find money. And our job is to make the strong case for why they shouldn't make that happen. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk about the lessons learned. This is where everybody should have their pencils up, and they should be writing down these highlights, and I'm going to zip through them very quickly. They get to why we think we have had qualified progress so far, and I think they indicate the direction that we want to continue moving into in the future. We planned strategically, and we executed in unison. The first item, we united around one issue. Even though there were coalition members who do not rely heavily on major donations, All members of the sector recognize the immense threat to the sector and communities at large. So at Leadership 18, we're an organization of all CEOs, 22, not 18, of the biggest philanthropies. Even those organizations that don't rely on major donations to survive as a major part of their business model took this on as their one and only area of focus for advocacy. That is because we understood that we needed to unite around this issue. We made diversity our strength. We made no distinctions regarding the importance of arts or eds or meds or human services. We assessed the legislative political situation accurately. We acted according to early intelligence on the Hill, much in the way that you've seen us doing today, and that allowed us to make sure that our message was focused and that we were addressing the concerns we know that policymakers had. Based on that intel, we used tested messaging. And that's where we came up with our mantra, which I hope you will say over and over again: now is not the time to experiment with reduced incentives to give. We tapped credible messengers early. That's you guys, you gals in this room. We got buy-in from all kinds of funders and frontline community-based orgs to write op-eds, to do interviews, to commit to sending their advocates to the Hill. On execution, in unison, we showed out. Very importantly, we used the media to tell the public and policymakers early why we were coming. And when we got here, we sounded our message very clearly. And when we left, we told our message again through the media to make sure we didn't just show up, but that people knew why we were here, and we used those as messaging opportunities. We showed up strong. More than 300 folks swarming the Hill. They're still talking about it today. Both the Democratic and the Senate side talked about it. We empowered team leaders to make sure that they prepped you all so that you went out and talked a message. We equipped our networks to ramp up using Twitter and all kinds of social media to push out the message. And then finally, this is what we hope you remember. We set the expectation that we have to be in it for the long haul. So thank you for being here today as part of that long haul trek, and I think we're going to continue to prevail as we act strategically and in unison.
Well, thanks, and I just want to echo a little bit of what Gloria said, but also I want to say that it's just a real pleasure for me to be a part of this event again. I see so many faces out there, and in fact, I guess it was 6 years ago now, was at the Council on Foundations, and Foundations on the Hill was my favorite event, for those of you who remember, and I enjoyed every bit of it. So it's just gratifying to see how the event has grown, how many people are here, and as I said back then, and I continue to say, the first real, the first way that you send a message is by being here. By just being here, you've already sent a message, and by going to the Hill tomorrow, the same message that we said back in December, it's being here, it's being willing to go up to the Hill to talk about what you do and to talk about these critical issues. So it's just great to be a part of this event and to kind of just share my perspective. Now that I'm at the Council for Advancement and Support of Education, which is, for those of you who don't know, a professional association that represents alumni relations, communications, and development professionals at colleges and universities. And we were, and to give you a sense of CASE's membership, there are over 3,600 educational institutions that are members in over 76 countries. We have offices in Singapore, London, Mexico City, along with here in DC. So educational fundraising and alumni relations communications is now a global phenomenon, not just a phenomenon here in the US. So our focus, we've been and are proud to have been from the beginning a very strong and active member of the Charitable Giving Coalition. And it was really, for us, it was very easy. I mean, we asked when this proposal was first brought up, as Sue said, back in as part of the first budget that President Obama proposed. We went out to our members and said, looking at this issue, how many of you are concerned about the 28% cap proposal? And we got a whopping 80% response back saying, yeah, we're concerned about it. And that was 4 years ago. So we've, since that time, been even more active and engaged and been trying to be as active as possible in the Charitable Giving Coalition. And more importantly, for where we stand in the charitable sector, encourage some of our educational associations colleagues, and there's, for those of you who don't know about associations, well, there's an association for everything, as you know, in DC, but for education, there are a ton of associations. So trying to get them more active and engaged, and to take a position on this issue and really recognize the important role that private support plays for educational institutions. We've been working on that since 4 years ago. I'm just going to mention very briefly, because I do want to hear questions and get to the discussion part of the panel, just some of the things, some of the lessons learned that I took away from what happened in December, and share a little bit from the perspective of education and the arts and some of those sectors that are kind of viewed for whatever reason as being the only the wealthy want to give to our types of organizations. And certainly, while that's the case, there are a lot of high income taxpayers and donors tend to give more to education and the arts and museums and some of those types of charitable organizations. It's important to remember, and I think Mr. Reed had a good point about talking about civil society and how we fit into that role in civil society. And I also talked about the importance of education and how giving to education, we talk about the importance of having a college degree and being in higher ed, and somehow when we talk about it in terms of private support, that's not something that benefits low-income individuals or the poor. So I think that's something that we've really focused on, talking about the importance of private support for financial aid, for the types of programs and access to education, which is critical. So just talking a little bit about December and the Charitable Giving Coalition advocacy event, I think we learned a few things, and I'll probably just reiterate a couple of those issues that were brought up by Gloria. But first is, focus was absolutely critical. We all came in, we all have different interests. I can tell you educational institutions have a variety of different interests when it comes to their interaction with the federal government, but the focus of this was the charitable deduction and preserving the charitable deduction. I can't tell you how important that was. Also reiterating what Gloria said about the diversity of the sector and the power of that. I thought it was great as part of the advocacy day that I went into meetings along with folks from hospitals, from folks from we had a group also from a mission, from just a variety of different types of charitable organizations. I thought that was a very powerful message, so we came in together as a charitable community, and I think that's our strength. And so when there's talking about why different charities should be treated differently, I think it's important to remember that when we segment ourselves out or pull ourselves apart like that, or allow ourselves to be pulled apart, that we lose that power and that voice and that value. I think it's important to remember that there is strength in the diversity of the sector. I also thought that we gained a lot of traction when we started talking about the burden of the policy. You've heard a lot about how, from lawmakers and others, about how this is somehow a tax break for the wealthy, and the wealthy benefit from the charitable deduction. I think we pushed back pretty hard on that. We need to continue doing that and talk about how the burden of this policy change, whether it's a cap or any other policy, the burden is going to fall on those served by our organizations. And I think we really reiterated that, and I think that really had some traction and helped with the issue. I also thought that just being here in Washington and being up on the Hill, before December, before we had the advocacy day on the Hill, the talk was about how much revenue does capping itemized deductions pay? How much revenue can we get from the charitable deduction? Well, it's much harder to talk about it in terms of a number and revenue and what you're going to get when you have people coming in and talking about what's the real human impact going to be of that policy. So I thought we humanized it very well, and that's the importance of days like this, is to talk about the work and to make it and to humanize that. And the final thing that I'll say is, as you can tell from the panel this morning, while there's a lot of good things that are always said about the charitable sector and the charitable deduction, this may be, December was critical time. This is probably even more of a critical time this year. There's a lot of vulnerability out there for the charitable deduction. There's a lot of danger out there. We need to stay engaged. We need to keep coming to the Hill. Anytime that it's great that this event happens now, because we had the Hill Day in December. Now, Foundation's on the Hill right now. You're keeping that engagement up. You're keeping folks coming to the Hill, talking to folks, making sure they don't forget about the importance of our sector and the importance of the charitable deduction. So it's just going to be critical to stay engaged throughout the rest of the year, and as this debate goes on, probably multiple years, but we just need to continue to be energized and engaged. So just again, thanks for all of the work that you do, for coming here, and for being willing to take some time out of your busy schedule to make your voice heard on this critical issue.
Good morning. I'm delighted to see so many friendly faces. As Sue suggested, I'm going to reflect on the panel this morning and talk a little bit about what I heard and what that could mean for the next couple of months, and then talk about some of the lessons learned from the fiscal cliff and how that translates into some of these budget fights. So what we heard this morning is that we have a lot of budget fights coming up. Whether you call it a fiscal cliff fight or a budget fight or tax reform, it's all about the same thing. It's all about Democrats and Republicans identifying whether we're going to have higher taxes or increased spending cuts or a combination of the both. And so it does not make a difference what we call it. Both sides are trying to squeeze more out of what we have. We are taking in too little revenue and spending too much money. And how that plays out is important, but it's mostly important because of what we care about, which is the charitable deduction. We don't want the charitable deduction to be a casualty of the bigger political fight. And I think that is the biggest lesson learned from the fiscal cliff fight, is that we were on message and we stayed on message. We did not allow ourselves to get pulled into the politics of higher rates versus cutting spending. And boy, were we challenged. We were challenged by Republicans and Democrats. Come on over. If you support higher rates, we'll save you. Come on over. If you support higher cuts in spending, we'll protect you. And while we were certainly flattered, we didn't allow that. We didn't allow ourselves to get pulled off message. We said, thank you, we're staying on message. We don't want Democrats or Republicans to impact the charitable deduction. You all fight the good fight on the rates and the spending cuts. We're staying on the deduction. And I think that took a lot of members by surprise. I think also they respected us much more because we were firm. We're not going to get into your political food fight. We are about the charities, the foundations, and about the charitable deductions. So I think that is one of the biggest lessons learned. Don't get deterred. Stay on message. You'll gain more respect, and you won't get pulled back and forth. So I think, again, that was a big lesson learned. Another lesson learned was the personality issue, and I think my friends and my colleagues suggested that. One of our biggest assets in the Charitable Giving Coalition is that we have foundation leaders, we have charitable leaders from all over. We had folks from zoos and from museum directors and gospel rescue missions. And what we found was that when you get into these meetings in members' offices, to have someone from a mission talk about the importance of feeding a body and feeding a soul, and that is what museums do, is breathtaking. And you can really see see the impact on staff and members when they hear disparate organizations talking about each other and how important the different missions are. That's critical. Don't go in with people who are similarly situated. Yes, you will have an impact, but you will have much more of an impact, A, if you bring your grantees in, B, if you go with strange bedfellows. People will remember you more. And that is a big lesson learned from our flying back in December. And then finally, being targeted. Identify in a very strategic way who's a player and who's not. We all have very limited resources. And to the extent that we can, with political intelligence and early political intelligence, identify who's really playing on this issue and who's not, and targeting your resources, whether it is the press, or whether it is emails or tweets or meetings back home or here in Washington. Don't waste your time hitting every single member of Congress, because while they all think they're critical to legislation, we know that there are certain members that are first among equals because they happen to play on the tax issues. That's your sweet spot. And so take your guidance from ACR, from the council, and the forum, and your advisors, and target the folks who are really in play. I know Allison's going to talk a little bit about communications, and so I'm going to stop right there and turn to Allison, and then we'll get to your questions. But thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'm going to sound a little bit like a
a broken record because these other three wonderful panelists have covered a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I would love for you all to look at me the entire time. However, I'm going to ask that you look at the slides that I'm going to be putting up. As a communicator, it is my job to tell a story, and pictures are always fun. It doesn't matter what age you are. So today I'm going to talk about how you guys can empower yourselves to talk about your missions, and how you can do that through using the media and using social media as a way to do that. Most of you guys probably are not paying attention to what's going on in Washington 24/7 like we are, but you're probably familiar with what's going on. And you're probably wondering what the heck Congress is doing other than nothing. Therefore, the 13% approval rating, which I'm pretty sure is lower than like felons. I'm not sure. It's definitely lower than used car sentences. But it's not good. So we're all aware that they've got a little bit of an image issue. So one thing that I will tell you, I worked on Capitol Hill for one of those very popular congressmen. And my glamorous job was to gather press clips every morning. So exciting. It's sort of intern work, and I got paid almost nothing. It was great. And one of the things I learned was that the chief of staff, the LD, the communications director, the senator, these people looked at these news clips the first thing they did in the morning. It was delivered on their desk, and that was the first thing they did. And when they looked at the news clips, the things that were showing up in those news clips became the most important things they cared about, because that's what their constituents at home cared about. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. If you're not aware of what's going on, this is what this has to do with you. We're broke, and short of Congress basically going and robbing every bank in America and still not having enough money, they've got to find some revenue somewhere. And so we have a federal plate. And on this federal plate is a nice big side helping of charity in the form of the charitable deduction. It represents a nice, easy way to get revenue. Right now, Congress has already taken the unpopular step of raising tax rates. And so raising tax rates, again, is pretty much going to be a difficult stair to climb. So they're looking at other ways. The charitable deduction is right on that plate. You might hear what we call closing loopholes, and as it turns out, you are what they call a loophole. So when you hear that phrase, keep that in mind. So what's your goal here? What do we want to do about this? We want to get you off the plate, right? So it doesn't matter how we do it, we've got to get off the plate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a clip here that aired in Oklahoma, and it was the day after the House hearing that we've talked about on charitable giving incentives. And if you're congressmen or senators from Oklahoma, this is what they saw the next morning, and this is the type of clip that they saw in congressional districts across the country. And that news clip highlighted a human service organization, but I bet if we gathered everybody in this room, we could come up with hundreds and hundreds of different types of organizations that you all fund. And it's your job to tell your congressman and your senator and these people who are going to create tax laws that will impact you about what these organizations do in your communities. Like these ladies and gentlemen have talked about, we got together with the Charitable Giving Coalition in December and participated in Lobby Day. And these were some of the headlines that showed up the next day. So these are some of the things that members of Congress saw. They saw that we were serious about protecting the charitable deduction, and we weren't going to stay quiet, and that it wasn't something that they could just easily pick up for revenue. So this is why it's so important for you guys to take the media seriously. It shapes public opinion. It's so important for you to take the media into your own hands and use your social media tools to directly communicate with your customers and who is your member of Congress. Write an op-ed, engage in social media. All of these things will help you get to your end goal. And like Sandra has said, partnering with these charities to tell your story will be very important.